Picture a forest so dark that sunlight barely reaches the ground. 50 square miles of ancient fir trees, steep ravines, and mud that swallows men whole. This was the Hürtgen Forest, on the German-Belgian border. Between September 1944 and February 1945, this forest became a killing ground, the longest single battle the U.S. Army ever fought on German soil. 88 days of hell that cost more than 33,000 American casualties. Yet today, when we talk about World War II, we remember D-Day, we remember the Battle of the Bulge, but the Hürtgen, that name has faded from our collective memory. Why? Because this battle was different. This wasn't a victory parade. This was a meat grinder. And what happened in those dark woods remains one of the most controversial campaigns in American military history. This is the story of the Green Hell. By September 1944, the tide of war had turned. Allied forces had landed at Normandy, liberated Paris, and were racing across France. The German army appeared to be in full retreat. Many soldiers believed the war would be over by Christmas. But then they reached the German border. Stretching nearly 400 miles from north to south stood the Siegfried Line, what the Germans called the West Wall. Thousands of concrete pillboxes, bunkers, tank traps known as Dragon's Teeth, and dense minefields. The impenetrable fortress protecting the German homeland. And sitting directly in the path of the U.S. First Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, was the Hürtgen Forest. At first, American commanders didn't think much about the forest itself. Their eyes were on bigger prizes, the city of Aachen to the north, and beyond that, the Rhine River and the industrial heart of Germany. But there was a problem, a critical problem that would haunt this campaign. Just beyond the forest lay the Ruhr River and its dams, the Schwammenau and Erft. These massive concrete structures controlled millions of gallons of water. In German hands, they represented a terrifying weapon. With one command, the Germans could open the floodgates and turn the entire Ruhr Valley downstream into an impassable swamp, drowning any Allied advance for weeks. The American High Command, Generals Omar Bradley, Courtney Hodges, and J. Lawton Collins, believed the most direct route to seize those dams was straight through the forest. It was a decision that would cost thousands of lives.
The Hürtgen Forest was unlike any battlefield American soldiers had encountered. This wasn't the hedgerows of Normandy or the open fields of France. This was something primordial. The forest stretched across 50 square miles of the most unforgiving terrain imaginable. Dense stands of fir trees planted so close together their branches interlocked overhead, blocking out the sun. Visibility dropped to mere yards. In some places you couldn't see your own squad just feet away. The ground itself was treacherous. Steep ridges climbed and plunged without warning. Deep ravines like the Kahl Gorge cut through the landscape. Narrow trails, sometimes only 9 feet wide, became the only routes through the wilderness. And then there was the weather. September's autumn rains turned the forest floor into a quagmire. Water pooled in every depression. The few trails that existed became rivers of knee-deep mud. Trucks got stuck. Jeeps couldn't advance. Even tracked vehicles struggled. War correspondent Mac Morris wrote for Yank magazine, "The firs are thick, and there are 50 square miles of them standing, dismal and dripping. The bodies of the firs begin close to ground so that each fir interlocks its body with another. At the height of a man standing is a mass of dark, impenetrable green. The terrain neutralized every advantage the Americans had. Air superiority? Useless. Pilots couldn't see through the canopy to spot targets. Artillery? Limited effectiveness when you can't observe where your shells are landing. Tanks and armored support? They couldn't navigate the mud and narrow trails. This would be an infantryman's fight, man against man, in the worst conditions imaginable. As temperatures dropped in November and December, rain turned to sleet, then snow. Soldiers lived in waterlogged foxholes, never dry, never warm. Trench foot and pneumonia claimed thousands before they ever saw the enemy. The forest itself had become a weapon. But nature wasn't the only enemy waiting in the Hürtgen. The German defenders, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, had turned the forest into a fortress.
The Siegfried Line ran directly through these woods. Hundreds of concrete bunkers and pillboxes, carefully camouflaged and positioned with interlocking fields of fire. Many had been built years before the war, with thick walls that could withstand direct hits from American artillery. Between these strong points, the Germans laid extensive minefields. The dreaded S-mine, soldiers called it the Bouncing Betty, was everywhere. Step on the trigger, and it would pop up to waist height before exploding, designed to maximize casualties. These mines didn't just kill, they maimed, they terrorized, and they slowed every advance to a crawl. Every trail was mined, every firebreak was covered by hidden machine guns. The Germans had another advantage, one that turned the dense forest into an even deadlier trap. They had pre-plotted artillery targets for every clearing, every trail junction, every approach. German artillery crews knew this terrain intimately and could rain shells down with devastating accuracy. But the most feared weapon in the Hürtgen wasn't a mine or a bunker. It was what soldiers called tree bursts. Artillery shells fired into the dense forest would explode when they struck the treetops, 40 or 50 feet above the ground. The explosion sent hot steel shrapnel down in a deadly cone. But that wasn't all. The blast shattered the fir trees themselves, creating thousands of wooden splinters, some as large as javelins, that rained down with the shrapnel. Ernest Hemingway, who witnessed the battle as a war correspondent, described it as Passchendaele with tree bursts, comparing it to one of the bloodiest battles of World War I. Foxholes offered almost no protection. The deadly shower came from above. Soldiers described the sound of tree bursts as the forest itself screaming. Technical Sergeant George Morgan of the 22nd Infantry remembered, "The forest was a hell of an eerie place to fight. You can't get protection, you can't see, you can't get fields of fire. Artillery slashes the trees like a scythe. Everything is tangled. You can scarcely walk." The Germans, many of them veterans of fighting in the forests of Russia and Finland, understood this terrain. They knew how to use it. The Americans were learning the hard way. Starting in mid-September 1944, American divisions were fed into the forest one after another. The 3rd Armored Division went in first, followed by the 9th Infantry Division in October. Then came the 4th Infantry Division, which had landed at Utah Beach on D-Day. And then, in November, came the 28th Infantry Division. The 28th was a Pennsylvania National Guard division, identified by their distinctive red keystone shoulder patch. The Germans had given them a nickname, the Bloody Bucket. On November 2nd, the 28th entered the Hürtgen with orders to capture the town of Schmidt and advance toward the Rohr River dams. What followed became one of the most costly divisional attacks of the entire European campaign. The 28th attacked through the Kahl Trail, a narrow supply route that dropped down into the Kahl Gorge. German forces held the high ground on both sides. It was a death trap. Within days, the division was being torn apart. Tree bursts, constant artillery, counterattacks by well-positioned German infantry. The 28th briefly captured Schmidt, only to be driven out by a massive German counteroffensive. Company after company was decimated. Officers and sergeants fell at devastating rates. By November 20th, rifle companies had lost more than 40% of their strength. Some units lost more than 100% of their original personnel, meaning they'd been replaced multiple times. The battle became what soldiers called it, the death factory. Men fought without sleep in freezing mud. Supply lines broke down. Hot food became a memory. Soldiers went days eating only cold rations. The wounded had to be carried back on litters for miles through the mud and minefields. One regimental surgeon reported that litter bearers would work until they were exhausted and then drop. The 4th Infantry Division alone used 140 additional litter bearers during their time in the forest. And still they fought. Not for glory, not for victory parades, but because they'd been ordered to take that ground, and American soldiers don't quit. The 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Division lost 108 officers and more than 2,500 enlisted men in just 18 days of combat. They advanced 6,000 yards through the forest, an average of just over 300 yards per day. 1 soldier for every 2 yards gained. By the end of November, the 28th Infantry Division had suffered over 6,000 casualties. They had accomplished little strategically, but they had paid an enormous price. The division was pulled from the line, battered and spent. On December 13, 1944, 3 months after the first Americans entered the Hürtgen Forest, the U.S. Army finally launched a direct assault on the Rohr River dams themselves.
But 3 days later, on December 16th, everything changed. The Germans launched their massive Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and reach Antwerp. The Hürtgen Forest, it turned out, had been the northern anchor of the German defensive line, buying time for this final offensive. The battle for the forest effectively ended that day. American forces were withdrawn or shifted to deal with the German breakthrough. The fight for the dams would have to wait. It wasn't until early February 1945 that American forces finally captured the Rohr River dams. But even in defeat, the Germans had the last word. They jammed open the floodgates before retreating, releasing millions of gallons of water. The Ruhr Valley flooded, delaying the Allied advance for another 2 weeks. The objective had been achieved, but at what cost? Military historian Charles B. MacDonald, who fought in the Hürtgen as a company commander, later called it a misconceived and basically fruitless battle that should have been avoided. So why is the Battle of Hürtgen Forest forgotten? The answer is simple. It was overshadowed. The Battle of the Bulge, which began just as Hürtgen was ending, captured the public imagination. It had dramatic counterattacks, the siege of Bastogne, and ultimately a clear American victory. It became the story everyone remembered. Hürtgen didn't fit that narrative. There was no triumph to celebrate, no iconic photographs that captured American heroism. Just a dark forest, brutal casualties, and strategic questions that still haunt military historians today. The numbers tell the story. Between September 1944 and February 1945, approximately 33,000 American soldiers became casualties in the Hürtgen Forest. Some estimates run as high as 55,000 when including all combat and non-combat losses. Disease, exposure, and psychiatric casualties added thousands more. German losses were severe, at least 28,000 casualties. Many rifle companies suffered 100 to 200% casualties, meaning entire units were wiped out and replaced, sometimes multiple times. Today, the Hürtgen Forest is quiet. Memorials stand among the trees. You can still see the scars, the stumps of trees destroyed by artillery, the crumbling remains of German bunkers, the dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line slowly being reclaimed by nature.
For the veterans who survived, the forest never left them. They carried it in their nightmares, in the sound of wind through trees, in every cold rain. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest stands as a reminder that not every battle and war is a victory, that courage and sacrifice don't always lead to strategic success, and that sometimes the price of taking ground is too high, even when you take it. The soldiers who fought in the Green Hell deserve to be remembered, not for a glorious victory, but for endurance, for facing an enemy they couldn't see in a forest designed to kill them and fighting anyway. Their story is one of the untold chapters of World War II, and it should never be forgotten. If you want to learn more about the forgotten battles of World War II, hit that like button and subscribe to Untold War Chronicles. Drop a comment below telling us which forgotten battle we should cover next, because history isn't just about the victories, it's about the truth.